Imagine standing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with nothing but endless blue stretching in every direction. No ships, no cities, no voices. Just the steady rhythm of waves crashing against dark volcanic cliffs. Now picture this. More than 500 kilometers off the coast of West Africa, a group of Portuguese sailors sails through a blanket of mist. As the fog slowly lifts, a chain of rugged islands appears on the horizon. They aren't searching for a lost civilization. They aren't uncovering the ruins of an ancient kingdom. Instead, they find something far stranger. An entire archipelago that, as far as anyone knows, has never been home to a single human being. No temples carved into stone, no abandoned villages, no legends passed down through generations. Nothing. For millions of years, these volcanic islands had stood alone in the Atlantic, untouched by human footsteps. While empires rose and fell across Africa, Europe, and Asia, these isolated peaks remained silent, waiting for history to find them. But that discovery would change far more than a few empty islands. Within decades, they would become one of the most important crossroads on Earth, a place where continents met, cultures collided, fortunes were made, and countless lives were forever changed. So how did a forgotten chain of volcanic rocks become one of the Portuguese Empire's greatest strategic prizes? And how did a land with no native population give birth to one of the world's most remarkable cultures? This is the extraordinary story of Cabo Verde. Long before a single sail appeared on the horizon, nature had already spent millions of years shaping these islands. Round 40 to 50 million years ago, powerful volcanic activity deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean forced molten rock toward the surface. Layer upon layer of hardened lava slowly formed a chain of islands that would eventually become Cabo Verde. Each island developed its own personality. Some were dry and windswept, others were crowned by towering volcanic peaks. On Fogo, one of the Atlantic's most active volcanoes, continued to reshape the landscape with dramatic eruptions, reminding everyone that the earth beneath their feet was still alive. Despite their rugged beauty, these islands remained completely isolated. Their distance from the African mainland, combined with powerful ocean currents, kept them beyond the reach of early explorers and migrating civilizations. While kingdoms flourished across West Africa and European nations expanded their influence, Cabo Verde remained untouched, existing almost like a forgotten corner of the world. Everything changed during the Great Age of Exploration. In the middle of the 15th century, Portugal was pushing farther into the Atlantic than any European kingdom before it. Backed by Prince Henry the Navigator's vision of maritime expansion, Portuguese expeditions searched for new trade routes, new opportunities, and a path around Africa. During the 1460s, explorers including Antonio de Noli and Alvise Cadamosto reached these remote islands. What they found wasn't a thriving society. It wasn't a battlefield waiting to be conquered. It was something even more valuable to an expanding empire, a completely unclaimed territory sitting at the crossroads between Europe, Africa, and, eventually, the Americas. To the Portuguese crown, Cabo Verde was more than an isolated archipelago. It was a strategic opportunity unlike any other. The islands offered a natural stopping point for ships crossing the Atlantic, making them an ideal base for trade, navigation, and exploration. Their position alone gave them enormous importance in a rapidly changing world. Yet the story that followed wasn't simply about empire or geography. It became the story of ordinary people brought together under extraordinary circumstances. People from different continents, speaking different languages, carrying different traditions, would gradually create something entirely new. Out of hardship, survival, and adaptation, a unique culture would emerge, one that belonged neither completely to Europe nor entirely to Africa. It belonged to Cabo Verde alone. And that remarkable journey was only just beginning. In 1462, the Portuguese established Ribeira Grande, known today as Cidade Velha, on the island of Santiago. It became the first permanent European settlement in the tropical Atlantic, a milestone that marked the beginning of a completely new chapter in world history. At first glance, the decision seemed almost irrational. The islands were rocky, dry, and often unforgiving. Fresh water was scarce, fertile land was limited, and long periods without rain could turn entire valleys into dusty landscapes. But Portugal wasn't searching for paradise. It was building an empire. And from that perspective, Cabo Verde was perfectly placed. Sitting between Europe, the West African coast, and the emerging Atlantic routes, the islands quickly became an essential stopping point for ships carrying people, supplies, and valuable cargo across the ocean. With the settlers came sugarcane, cotton, livestock, and new farming techniques. Warehouses appeared along the harbor. Churches rose above the growing town. Stone streets echoed with the footsteps of merchants, sailors, officials, and explorers arriving from every direction. The once silent islands suddenly found themselves connected to a world that was expanding at an astonishing pace. Yet this growing prosperity carried a devastating human cost. As the transatlantic slave trade expanded, Cabo Verde became one of its key hubs. Enslaved Africans were brought from the nearby West African coast to work on plantations, serve the growing settlement, and be transported onward across the Atlantic. Families were torn apart, cultures were uprooted, and countless lives were forever changed by a system built on exploitation. It remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the islands. And yet, even within unimaginable hardship, something unexpected began to take shape. People from different African communities lived alongside Portuguese settlers and their descendants. Languages blended in everyday conversation. Traditions merged. Music, food, beliefs, and customs slowly intertwined. Over generations, a distinct Creole identity emerged, not imposed from above, but created naturally by people adapting to a shared reality. It was a culture born not from comfort, but from resilience. Nature, however, had no intention of making life easy. Rainfall was unpredictable. Entire seasons could pass without meaningful precipitation. Crops failed with alarming regularity, and every harvest became a gamble against the climate. The people learned to survive by conserving every available resource, relying on one another whenever the land refused to provide. Their greatest strength became adaptability. As the 16th century unfolded, Cabo Verde's importance continued to grow. Merchant ships traveling between Europe, Africa, and the Americas increasingly relied on the islands for supplies, repairs, and fresh provisions. The harbor at Ribeira Grande grew busier every year, transforming the settlement into one of the Atlantic's busiest commercial crossroads. Wealth flowed through its streets. But wealth rarely remains unnoticed. Soon, another kind of visitor began appearing on the horizon. Pirates, privateers, and rival European powers eager to weaken Portugal's expanding influence. For them, Cabo Verde wasn't simply a group of islands. It was a prize worth attacking. In 1585, the famous English privateer Sir Francis Drake launched a raid on Ribeira Grande. His forces plundered the settlement before disappearing back into the Atlantic, leaving destruction in their wake. The attack exposed a harsh truth. Prosperity had made the islands powerful, but it had also made them vulnerable. The danger didn't end there. More than a century later, in 1712, the French naval commander Jacques Cassard led another devastating assault. This raid proved even more destructive, inflicting damage from which Ribeira Grande would never fully recover. Its golden age was over. Recognizing the settlement's growing vulnerability, the Portuguese gradually shifted the colonial capital to the more defensible plateau of Praia, where steep terrain offered greater protection against future attacks. But human enemies weren't the only threat. The islands themselves remained restless. On Fogo, powerful volcanic eruptions repeatedly reminded residents that the land beneath them was still being shaped by forces far older than civilization itself. Rivers of lava destroyed homes and farmland, while thick clouds of ash blanketed entire communities. Each eruption forced families to make impossible choices. Some rebuilt where they had always lived. Others left everything behind, seeking safety on neighboring islands like Brava. Life in Cabo Verde became an endless exercise in adaptation. Whether facing invading fleets, failed harvests, or the fury of an active volcano, the people learned the same lesson again and again. Survival belonged to those who could change without losing hope. But the greatest test the islands would ever face was still waiting just beyond the horizon. By the 18th century, the Atlantic world was changing. For generations, Cabo Verde had prospered because of its position along the great trade routes. Ships came and went almost constantly, carrying goods, travelers, and, tragically, enslaved people across the ocean. The islands had become deeply tied to a system that stretched from Europe to Africa and the Americas. But history has a way of rewriting the rules. As the movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade gathered momentum during the late 18th and 19th centuries, the economic foundation that had sustained Cabo Verde began to crumble. The ships still crossed the Atlantic. The oceans were just as vast. But fewer stopped in Cabo Verde. Trade slowed. Investment faded. Jobs disappeared. The busy ports that had once buzzed with activity grew quieter with every passing year. For many families, survival became harder than ever. Then, nature delivered another cruel blow. The islands had always lived under the shadow of drought, but now the dry seasons grew even more devastating. Years sometimes passed with almost no meaningful rainfall. Rivers vanished, wells dried up, fields that had once supported entire communities turned into cracked, dusty earth. Centuries of deforestation and overgrazing had stripped much of the land of its natural ability to hold moisture. Every failed rainy season made the next one even more dangerous. Hunger spread from village to village. Famine became a recurring tragedy rather than an isolated disaster. Thousands of people died, not because they lacked the strength to survive, but because the land itself could no longer provide enough to sustain them. Perhaps even more painful was the response from Portugal. From Lisbon, Cabo Verde had become little more than a distant colonial outpost. Relief often arrived too slowly, or not at all. Many islanders felt abandoned by the very empire that had ruled them for centuries. It was no longer just a struggle against drought. It was a struggle against neglect, against being forgotten. Faced with impossible conditions, many made the heartbreaking decision to leave the only home they had ever known. Their destination wasn't another African colony. It was the open sea. American whaling ships, sailing through the Atlantic in search of sperm whales, frequently stopped near Cabo Verde to recruit experienced sailors. The people of islands like Brava and Fogo had spent generations mastering the ocean, making them valuable crew members. One by one, families said goodbye. Young men climbed aboard foreign ships with no guarantee they would ever return. Some settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Others built new lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and elsewhere along the New England coast. What began as economic necessity slowly became one of the world's most remarkable diasporas. Even today, there are more people of Cabo Verdean heritage living abroad than on the islands themselves, a lasting reminder of how deeply migration shaped the nation's identity. Yet even as thousands departed, A different kind of movement was beginning at home, one that wasn't driven by survival, but by hope. The 20th century opened with Cabo Verde still trapped in uncertainty. The economy remained fragile, opportunities were scarce. And then came two of the darkest chapters in the nation's history. Between 1941 and 1943, followed by another catastrophic famine between 1947 and 1948, prolonged drought, combined with a severe drought in the north and east of the country, created inadequate colonial relief, created a humanitarian disaster. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives. Entire communities were pushed to the edge of collapse. For many Cabo Verdeans, these tragedies became impossible to ignore. If change was ever going to come, it would have to come from the people themselves. A new generation of students, teachers, writers, and intellectuals began questioning the colonial system more openly than ever before. Among them was a brilliant agronomist named Amilcar Cabral. Cabral understood agriculture, he understood economics, but more importantly, he understood people. He believed that true independence wasn't simply about replacing one flag with another. It meant giving ordinary people the dignity to shape their own future. In 1956, together with his brother Luis Cabral and other supporters, he helped establish the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cabo Verde, better known as the PAIGC. Its vision was bold. Rather than treating Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde as separate colonial possessions, the movement imagined a shared future built on freedom, equality, and self-determination. It wasn't merely the birth of a political party, it was the birth of a new idea. For the first time in centuries, the people of Cabo Verde could see a future that wasn't being written in Lisbon. They were beginning to write it themselves. And before long, events unfolding thousands of kilometers away in Portugal would open the door they had been waiting for. By the early 1970s, the Portuguese Empire was beginning to crack. Across Africa, independence movements were growing stronger, and maintaining the empire had become increasingly costly. Portugal was fighting colonial wars on multiple fronts, draining its economy and testing the patience of its own people. For Cabo Verde, however, the road to freedom looked different. Unlike many African nations that endured long and devastating wars on their own soil, the island's struggle was driven largely by political organization, diplomacy, and the growing momentum created by the PAIGC. While Guinea-Bissau experienced an armed liberation campaign, Cabo Verde's path was shaped more by negotiation than by battlefield conflict. Then history took an unexpected turn. On April 25, 1974, a peaceful military uprising known as the Carnation Revolution swept through Portugal. Ordinary citizens placed red carnations into the barrels of soldiers' rifles, creating one of the most powerful symbols of peaceful revolution in modern history. Almost overnight, decades of authoritarian rule came to an end. The new Portuguese government quickly recognized that the colonial era could no longer continue. The empire that had stretched across continents for centuries was reaching its final chapter. For the people of Cabo Verde, the moment they had dreamed about for generations had finally arrived. After months of negotiations and political transition, independence became a reality. On July 5, 1975, in the capital city of Praia, Portuguese colonial rule officially came to an end. For the first time in more than 500 years, the future of the islands rested in the hands of their own people. A new flag was raised, a new government took office, and the Republic of Cabo Verde was born. It was far more than a political ceremony. It was the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. But independence didn't magically solve every problem. The new nation inherited enormous challenges. There were few natural resources. Fresh water remained limited. Drought was still a constant threat. The economy was fragile, and thousands of Cabo Verdeans continued to seek opportunities overseas. Building a country from those circumstances required more than optimism. It required patience, vision, and extraordinary resilience. Rather than relying on resources they didn't have, Cabo Verde invested in the one resource that had always carried it forward: its people. Education became a national priority. Public institutions were strengthened. Communities worked together to improve healthcare, infrastructure, and social stability. Just as importantly, the country embraced the millions of Cabo Verdeans living abroad. Its diaspora became one of its greatest strengths, sending knowledge, investment, and opportunity back to the islands while preserving deep cultural ties across generations. Then came another defining milestone. In 1991, Cabo Verde peacefully transitioned to a multi-party democratic system. At a time when many newly independent nations were struggling with instability, military coups, or civil conflict, Cabo Verde chose another path. Power changed hands through elections. Democratic institutions grew stronger. International observers increasingly recognized the country as one of Africa's most stable and well-governed democracies. Yet perhaps the nation's greatest achievement wasn't political. It was cultural. Over centuries, people with African and European roots had created something entirely their own. The Cape Verdean Creole language became the heartbeat of everyday life. Music carried memories that history books never could. The haunting melodies of Morna, later introduced to audiences around the world by legendary singer Cesaria Evora, captured both the sorrow of separation and the quiet hope that has always defined the islands. Every note told a story of migration, of longing, of survival, of home. Today, Cabo Verde is no longer the forgotten chain of volcanic islands that Portuguese sailors stumbled upon in the 15th century. It is no longer remembered only as a stop along old trade routes, or as a colony struggling through famine and hardship. Instead, it stands as one of Africa's most remarkable success stories, a nation that transformed isolation into connection and adversity into resilience. From the black volcanic slopes of Fogo to the colorful streets of Mindelo, from the historic stone buildings of Cidade Velha to the modern skyline of Praia, the islands tell the story of people who refused to let geography define their future. Perhaps that's the greatest lesson Cabo Verde has to offer. A nation isn't built by the size of its land, the wealth beneath its soil, or the power of its rulers. It's built by the determination of its people. Because history shows us that even the most isolated place on Earth can become a bridge between continents, and even the harshest volcanic rock can become the foundation of a thriving nation. That is the story of Cabo Verde. Not simply a story of islands in the Atlantic, but a story of resilience, identity, and the remarkable ability of humanity to create hope where none seemed possible.